Okay, we should be on. This is riverwestradio.com, community-supported radio streaming live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm your host. My name is Michael Wordsworth, and welcome to Breaking Down the News, the show that presents the news highlights of the week, but with a twist. Breaking Down the News is more concerned in bringing you information that wasn't covered on the front pages. Headlines you don't want to miss because not listening could be dangerous to your freedom, liberty, and health. Let's break down the news. Over the last few years, in the news, nearly every victory that the FBI celebrates against terrorism is actually about stopping its own terrorist plots, fed to hapless individuals, often nudging them and pushing them down the road to become terrorists, despite commonly displaying little to no aptitude for actual terrorism. The New York Times was the latest newspaper to add to the criticism, saying, "We are beginning to question the FBI's penchant for setting up its own plots for the sake of a high-profile arrest of some clueless individuals." I quote the New York Times, "The United States has been narrowly saved from lethal terrorist plots in recent years, or so it has seemed. A would-be suicide bomber was intercepted on his way to the Capitol. A scheme to bomb synagogues and shoot Stinger missiles at military aircraft was developed by men in Newburgh, New York. And a fanciful idea to fly explosive-laden model planes into the Pentagon and the Capitol was hatched in Massachusetts. But all these dramas were facilitated by the FBI, whose undercover agents and informers posed as terrorists, offering a dummy missile, fake C4 explosives, a disarmed suicide vest, and rudimentary training. Suspects naively played their parts until they were arrested." As this New York Times article makes clear, claims of entrapment rarely work in these cases, but it certainly raises questions about whether the FBI is actually protecting us from real plots or spending time creating publicity stunts that leave some people in jail. No doubt, some of these setups bust people who could potentially be interested in taking part in attacks, if they had any real opportunity to do so. But in most cases, it doesn't seem like they would ever have had the opportunity unless the FBI was helping. In one case, the judge, even as she was sentencing Mr. Committee to decades in prison, admitted that the defendant wouldn't be a terrorist if it weren't for the FBI. To quote the judge, "Only the government could have made a terrorist out of Mr. Committee, whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean in its scope. In my opinion, the FBI shouldn't go out of the way to fabricate possible threats when actual threats remain a possibility, requiring all the agency's resources to keep us safe. There's no doubt that there are real plots being attempted, but wouldn't the FBI be better off focusing on those rather than fabricating situations that add fuel to the fire and waste resources?" Breaking Down the News wanted answers, and I, Michael Wordsworth, recently took a trip to the FBI offices to get those answers, as we will hear in this special on-the-scene interview with Deputy Director Hank Polarank. The FBI headquarters is a huge modern building in the middle of downtown. Cars and trucks drive past the front entrance on this very active street, and these doors will lead us to the elevators that will take us to the office of Deputy Director Hank Polarank.
Welcome to the FBI headquarters. Can I help you?
Yes, I have an appointment with Deputy Director Polarank.
And your name is?
Michael Wordsworth from riverwestradios.com, breaking down the news show.
Michael who? No.
The staff at the FBI was professional and courteous as they greeted me, and after a few security complications were smoothed out, I was soon able to get in to do my interview. Michael Wordsworth from Breaking Down the News.
Hey, come on in, take a seat.
And it was an interesting interview. How many terrorist plots has the FBI foiled in the last few years?
We've been busy, very busy with ongoing investigations. It's hard to say off the top of my head. 10, maybe 12?
And out of those 10 or 12 incidents, how many of those were not terrorist plots instigated by the FBI?
None actually.
Not one.
Well, the underwear bomber, that wasn't us.
But it came to light that the underwear bomber was forced onto the plane by a well-dressed man, and he didn't go through security. That wasn't the FBI.
No. Might have been Secret Service. I think they handled that one.
I'd like to quote an article from the New York Times. Can I?
Sure, go ahead.
This is an article by David K. Shipler, published April 29, 2012, and I quote, "But all these dramas were facilitated by the FBI, whose undercover agents and informers posed as terrorists offering a dummy missile, fake C4 explosives, a disarmed suicide vest, and rudimentary training. Suspects naively played their parts until they were arrested. When an Oregon college student, Mohammed Osman Mohammed, thought of using a car bomb to attack a festive Christmas tree lighting ceremony in Portland, the FBI provided a van loaded with 55-gallon drums of inert material, harmless blasting caps, a detonator cord, and a gallon of diesel fuel to make the van smell flammable. An undercover FBI agent even did the driving, with Mr. Muhammad in the passenger seat.
Yeah.
To trigger the bomb, the student punched a number into a cell phone and got no boom, only a bust. What do you say to that?"
What's your point?
My point is it sounds like we really don't have a terrorism problem in America beyond those plots the FBI makes up itself.
What? How did you get in here? Agent Smith?
Be right in.
What is it, sir? Hey, wait. How did you get in here? I don't believe this. He doesn't have clearance, sir. You'll have to come with me.
He doesn't have clearance? How did he get past you?
He snuck in here when I went to pay for the pizza delivery. I was there for a while. I wanted exact change.
Okay, hey, thanks for the interview. That's all I need now.
Sir, stop. Come back here.
He doesn't have clearance?
Thank you. Talk soon. You guys take care.
Security, we have a gate jumper headed for the elevators.
And whereas this interview did not yield all the answers I wanted, I did get to state my point. And as I was leaving the FBI building, I had the realization that making my point was worth the trip. You're listening to RiverWestRadio.com. Breaking down the news turns its focus now to Japan as we take an in-depth look at the status of the ongoing nuclear power plant crisis and how this crisis could potentially be the biggest disaster the world is facing today. The crisis is so alarming, Senator Ron Wyden considered it a national security issue for America and recently took a trip to Fukushima, Japan to investigate the situation, as this article from Washington's blog reports. After visiting Fukushima, Senator Ron Wyden warned that the situation was worse than reported and urged Japan to accept international help to stabilize the dangerous spent fuel pools. An international coalition of nuclear scientists and nonprofit groups are calling on the UN to coordinate a multinational effort to stabilize the fuel pools. Fuel pool number 4 is indeed the top short-term threat facing humanity. Anti-nuclear physician Dr. Helen Caldicott says that if fuel pool number 4 collapses, she herself will evacuate her family from Boston and move them to the southern hemisphere. This is an especially dramatic statement, given that the West Coast is much more directly in the path of Fukushima radiation than the East Coast. And nuclear expert Arnie Gunderson recently said, "There's more cesium in that Unit 4 fuel pool than in all 800 nuclear bombs exploded above ground." But of course, it would not, of course, in the situation with Fukushima, it would happen all at once if there were a meltdown. It would certainly destroy Japan as a functioning country. Move south of the equator equator if that ever happened. I think that's probably the lesson. This week, Senator Wyden said that the spent fuel is a national security threat to the U.S. Alternet asked Senator Wyden if he considers the spent fuel at Fukushima Daiichi a national security threat. In a statement released by his office, Wyden replied, "The radiation caused by the failure of the spent fuel pools in the event of another earthquake could reach the West Coast within days. That absolutely makes the safe containment and protection of the spent fuel a security issue for the United States." Robert Alvarez, a nuclear expert and a former special assistant to the United States Secretary of Energy, agrees, saying, "My major concern is that this effort to get the spent fuel out of there is not something you should be doing casually and taking your time on. Yet TEPCO's current plans are to hold the majority of the spent fuel on site for years in the same elevated, uncontained storage pools, only transferring some of the fuel into more secure hardened dry casks when the common pool reaches capacity. Government agencies underplaying risk, so no one has to do anything different. Why are American nuclear authorities ignoring this threat? Well, they are totally captured by the nuclear industry. And nuclear waste experts charge that the NRC is letting this threat of Fukushima fuel pools fester because acknowledging it would call into question safety at dozens of identically designed nuclear power plants around the U.S., which contain exceedingly high volumes of spent fuel in similar elevated pools outside of reinforced containment. In an interview with Alternet, Alvarez said that the Japanese government, TEPCO, and the U.S. NRC are reluctant to say anything publicly about the spent fuel threat because there is a tendency to want to provide reassurance that everything is fine. The U.S. government right now is engaged in its own kabuki theater to protect the U.S. industry from the real cost of the lessons at Fukushima, Gunter said. The NRC and its champions in the White House and on Capitol Hill are looking to obfuscate the real threats and the necessary policy changes to address the risk. There are 31 GE Mark I and Mark II boiling water reactors in the U.S., the type used at Fukushima. All of these reactors, which comprise just under a third of all nuclear reactors in the U.S., store their spent fuel in elevated pools located outside the primary or reinforced containment that protects the reactor core. Thus, the outside structure, the building ostensibly protecting the storage pools, is much weaker. In most cases, about as sturdy, experts describe in interviews with Alternet, as a structure one would find housing a car dealership or a Walmart. Remember that American nuclear power plants are storing much more nuclear fuel rods in highly vulnerable pools than even Fukushima. The NRC and Japanese claim that Fuel Pool 4 has been stabilized, but nuclear experts, including Arnie Gunderson, a former nuclear industry service vice president who coordinated projects at 70 U.S. nuclear power plants and warned days after the disaster at Fukushima last year of a Chernobyl on steroids, if the spent fuel pools were to ignite, strongly disagreed with this assessment. It is true that in May and June, the floor of the U4 SFP was reinforced, but not as strong as it was originally, Gunderson noted in an email to Alternet. The entire building, however, has not been reinforced and is damaged by the explosion in both 4 and 3. So structurally, U4 is not as strong as its original design required. Alvarez said that even if the Unit 4 structure has been tentatively stabilized, it doesn't change the fact. It sits in a structurally damaged building, is about 100 feet above the ground, and is exposed to the atmosphere in a high-consequence earthquake zone. He also said that the urgency of the situation is underscored by the ongoing seismic activity around northeast Japan, in which 13 earthquakes of magnitude 4.0 to 5.7 have occurred off the northeast coast of Honshu between April 14th and April 17th. This has been the norm since 3/11/2011, and larger quakes are expected closer to the power plant, said Alvarez. I'm Michael Wordsworth. You're listening to Breaking Down the News. You're listening to RiverWestRadio.com. The fate of the world now rests on reactor number 4. This is today's topic. Mitsuhui Murata, former Japanese ambassador to Switzerland and Senegal, the executive director of the Japanese Society for Global System and Ethics, made this comment. It is no exaggeration to say that the fate of Japan and the whole world depends on number 4 reactor. Mr. Murata's stunning statement should be front page news everywhere around the world. Why? Because he's right. If reactor number 4 suffers even a minor earthquake, it could set off a chain reaction of events that quickly lead to North America becoming uninhabitable by humans for centuries to come. Imagine California, Oregon, Washington states being inundated with radiation, up to 85 times the radiation released from Chernobyl. We're talking about the end of human life on the scale of continents. Here's how this could happen. According to Mr. Robert Alvarez, former senior policy advisor to the Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Security and the Environment at the U.S. Department of Energy. Mr. Alvarez states, the number 4 pool is about 100 feet above the ground, is structurally damaged, and is exposed to the open elements. If an earthquake or another event were to cause this pool to drain, this could result in a catastrophic radiological fire involving nearly 10 times the amount of cesium-137 released by the Chernobyl accident. The infrastructure to safely remove this material was destroyed, as it was at the other 3 reactors. Spent reactor fuel cannot be simply lifted into the air by a crane as if it were a routine cargo. In order to prevent severe radiation exposures, fires, and possible explosions, it must be transferred at all times in water and heavily shielded structures into dry casks. As this has never been done before, the removal of the spent fuel from the pools at the damaged Fukushima Daiichi reactors will require a major and time-consuming reconstruction effort and will be charted in unknown waters. He says 10 times the cesium of 137 of Chernobyl. Others say up to 85 times. Nobody is 100% certain of what would actually occur because this has never happened before. We are in uncharted territory as a civilization, facing a unique and imminent threat to our continued survival. And both governments and corporations that assured us nuclear power was safe are covering up the crisis while the world waits in the crosshairs of a potential nuclear apocalypse. Here's some facts regarding Fukushima. To better understand the severity of the situation, let's go over these facts regarding Fukushima's reactor number 4 that Breaking Down the News has assembled from available news sources. Reactor 4 contains 1,535 spent fuel rods, which remain highly radioactive. These fuel rods currently hold the potential to emit 37 million curies of radiation. These fuel rods are stored in a concrete pool located 100 feet above the ground inside the structurally compromised reactor building, effectively making the pool open to the air. The pool holding these fuel rods is structurally damaged. If an earthquake or another event were to cause this pool to drain, this could result in a catastrophic radiological fire involving nearly 10 times the amount of cesium-137 released by the Chernobyl accident, according to Mr. Alvarez, former senior policy advisor to the Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Security and the Environment at the U.S. Department of Energy. The infrastructure to safely remove this material was destroyed, as it was at the other 3 reactors, said Mr. Alvarez. Just 50 meters from reactor number 4, a much larger pool of spent fuel rods contains an amazing 6,375 fuel rods, all of which remain highly radioactive. All these fuel rods are astonishingly exposed to the open air. They are not held inside any containment vessel. The total number of spent fuel rods across all 6 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi site is 11,421. If reactor number 4 suffers a structural failure, the release of radiation from the 1,535 spent fuel rods would make it virtually impossible to work or to continue working on this site, potentially resulting in an inability to halt the massive radiation release from all the other rods. In all, we're talking about 11,421 fuel rods held at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, which contain 336 million curies of long-lived radioactivity. Roughly 134 million curies of that is cesium-137. Reactors that have been operating for decades, such as those at Fukushima Daiichi site, have generated some of the largest concentrations of radioactivity on the planet, Mr. Robert Alvarez said. This amount of cesium-137 radioactivity held in full collection of fuel rods at Fukushima is 85 times the amount released at Chernobyl. The release of this amount of cesium-137 would destroy the world environment and our civilization. This is an issue of human survival. The mainstream media operates in a total blackout of this news, refusing even to acknowledge the existence of this immediate threat to human civilization. The mainstream media is, in large part, owned by General Electric, the very company that designed the Fukushima reactors in the first place. It is clear that GE is diligently running a total media blackout on this news in order to cover its own butt and prevent people from asking questions about the faulty engineering and nuclear facility site selection that led to this catastrophe. 18,000 dead so far and hundreds of millions at risk as the media continues its cover-up. The executive branch and multiple federal agencies tasked with keeping the American public safe, did their best to hide and cover up information about the deadly radioactive plume and ensuing fallout that was headed for the west coast of the United States from Japan, says Alexander Higgins in his blog. He goes on to state, the evidence obtained in the FOIA request indicates that right from the start, the NRC had a clear idea of the significance of the disaster that was unfolding, but concealed the truth from the American public. The results of the plume and fallout can be measured in the rise of infant mortality rates. Cells of unborn and newborn children are dividing at a much higher rate than those of a mature adult. Thus, the amount of damage is greatly increased and hence more detectable. Conservative estimates place the number of stillborn following the Fukushima accident at over 18,000. I'm Michael Wordsworth. This is Breaking Down the News. You're listening to RiverWestRadio.com. Breaking Down the News brings you the latest updates. In response to this crisis, the last reactor of 50 in Japan was shut down. This report from Tokyo. Japan's last operating reactor was taken offline Saturday as public distrust created by last year's nuclear accident forced the nation to at least temporarily do without atomic power for the first time in 42 years. The reactor at the Tomari plant on the northern island of Hokkaido was shut down for legally mandated maintenance, said its operator, Hokkaido Electric. As Japan's 50 functional commercial reactors have been shut down one by one for maintenance, none have been restarted because of safety concerns since last year's Fukushima disaster. Desperate to avert possible power shortages this summer, the government has tried to convince the public to allow some of the reactors to be restarted. It has conducted simulated stress tests to show whether reactors can withstand the sort of immense earthquake and tsunami that knocked out the Fukushima Daiichi plant. However, the public has not accepted the tests, which were conducted largely behind closed doors. A number of critics have demanded more sweeping changes, like the creation of a more independent nuclear regulatory agency. Cozy ties between officials in the Trade Ministry, which both regulates and promotes nuclear power, and plant operators are widely seen as having left the Fukushima plant without adequate defenses against natural disaster. This distrust fed criticism that the authorities failed to protect the public after the accident and instead tried to cover up the full dangers. About 300 protesters gathered Saturday in front of the Trade Ministry to celebrate the temporary shutdown of the nation's nuclear program and to call for a permanent end. Tadao Sakuma, 81, who had joined a hunger strike in front of the ministry to oppose restarting the plants, toasted the news about the Tamari reactor. He said, "I want all reactors to be scrapped, and I'm going to live 20 years to see that through." Hiroki Tabucho contributed to this reporting. I'm Michael Wordsworth. This is Breaking Down the News. You're listening to RiverWestRadio.com. And we're back. Clearly, this was a tragic event that happened last year, and that event continues to affect us today. Hi, I'm Michael Wordsworth, and this is Breaking Down the News. In the second part of the show, we'd like to open up the phones to callers. If you'd like to call in and make a comment on either the FBI interview or the Fukushima crisis or any of the articles I'm about to read, please feel free to dial 414-935-2951. That number, 414-935-2951. It's also posted on the Ustream that you will see at riverwestradio.com. Just click the play button and you'll see the number there. The lines are open. I'm going to continue reading on with the news. And please, this is a combination news and talk show, variety show. In the future, we'll be having guests to come on to talk about local politics here in Milwaukee. We continuously mention world politics, world crisis, world issues as they relate to our nation, state, and local community here in River West. An article I'd like to bring up today now is from the American Thinker on May 7th, 2012, regarding the Constitution. Breaking Down the News continuously adheres to preserving our civil liberties, and we shall continue that cause by addressing the many, many attacks that have come on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights since 9/11 in recent years, and really over the last 4 to 5 decades. I'll continue with this article from the American Thinker by Janet Levy. The U.S. Constitution, which has guided American society for over 2 centuries, inspiring nations worldwide and serving as a model for governance, is under serious threat today. Ironically, that threat comes from the very individuals charged with protecting the Constitution: federal, state, and local government officials. All these public officials take an oath to support the Constitution and to refrain from actions or laws that interfere with individual rights and liberties specified in the Constitution. Yet President Obama and officials all along the way, down to local police chiefs, are today actively engaged in the daily shredding of the U.S. Constitution. The Obama administration has expanded its executive branch powers under a comprehensive czar system and myriad executive orders. Meanwhile, Congress quietly passes questionable legislation with the potential to limit personal freedoms. And U.S. agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, engage in activities that raise serious concerns about constitutional violations. Even local law enforcement officials have become increasingly intrusive and hostile to civil liberties. Several dramatic examples illustrate this growing problem and highlight the need for increased vigilance and public scrutiny. If we are to remain a constitutional republic with our individual rights intact, the Obama administration has established a precedent of not working with legislators from both parties to pass congressional bills. Instead, resorting to change laws and policies through executive fiat. With over 40 czars controlling various functions, he has structured a second tier of unaccountable government officials that operate behind the scenes away from the glare of public scrutiny. This shadow government undermines Congress, the people's representatives, and the cabinet secretaries who undergo a Senate vetting process. It subverts the foundational principle of government by representation for government by proxy. A dramatic example is the Council of Governors, established in January 2010, when Obama signed Executive Order 13528. The stated intent was to solidify the relationship between the federal and state governments and protect the nation. State governors representing 10 FEMA regions in the United States were appointed and serve at the pleasure of the president to represent the nation as a whole. Their duties include reviewing matters related to the National Guard of the various states, homeland defense, synchronization, and integration of state and federal military activities in the United States. Before I continue this article, I'd like to make the comment, what's the point of having a government? I mean, if we're going to just replace the government in the time of a crisis or an emergency, why do we have a government in the first place? Maybe we should just voluntarily give up the Bill of Rights and the voting process and just let this totalitarian nanny state take over. That way we'd be prepared for any crisis at any time, and we'd all be sitting at home eating our poisonous food, drinking our poisonous water, and listening to the brainwashed media that tells us everything's okay while we slowly die off. Again, what's the point of having a government that we fought 200 years ago to obtain our liberty from tyranny if in the event of any crisis, we're just going to give it up? It's called the Continuity of Government Program, the COG. Many amendments have been signed, many legislations put into effect since 9/11 greatly damaged this process. There's Executive Order PDD 51, which allows the president under any crisis, could be financial, could be natural disaster, it could be war. Here's the situation. The executive branch actually obtains powers during times of war. Without war, during peacetime, the executive branch is greatly limited. You see, we have in America a system of checks and balances, or at least we have for a long time. When these checks and balances are removed, all that we're left with is the potential for a totalitarian government. And what is a totalitarian government? Well, they can set taxes as high as they want. They can deny the necessary licensing and permits to accomplish anything, such as small business, large business, doesn't really matter. In fact, in a totalitarian government, you really don't get any input. Meanwhile, the rights of individuals are trampled on. Why is this important? Well, look, we're going to have to go back in history, way back to the 1200s, the early development of the Magna Carta. There was a situation where there was always some tyrant that ruled over us peasants. And by us peasants, I mean today we have a rapidly declining middle class, and compared to the fabulously wealthy, we're serfs, we're peasants, peons as they call them, P-E-O-N. And the problem with tyranny is when you don't have any means to address grievances in government, you have no choice but to experience revolution and revolt of the peasants. What we used to face even 200 years ago under King George But in human history, way before that, there's always been a tyrant. And the problem is, you couldn't hunt on the king's land. You couldn't use the king's water. We were given little parcels of land which we could dwell in and given no education, no reading materials. But that was the least of our problems. What we experienced is the king's men could at any point come in and haul us away without charges, without telling our families. Imagine that. You're a peasant living on a farm. Well, it's not that hard to imagine. I often feel like I'm a peasant living on my parcel of land. But so I'm sitting at home, and I don't like the king's policies. I don't like the fact that he raised my taxes, or now he's taxing me for windows or the air I breathe, Lord knows what. Or maybe I can't have access to food, or I can't even grow my own food. I have to work on his land and then buy the food back from him. Well, I have grievances that I'd like to address. But when you speak out against the authority in power, and that authority doesn't like it, a common tactic is to suppress those individuals that choose to revolt, speak out, or rise up. And in the old days, prior to the Magna Carta, prior to the Constitution of the United States, the king's men could just come in and abduct you. Very similar to what we would have today, where literally you are speaking out against policies of the government that you don't like, and suddenly now the government would declare you're a political dissident. You're a possible threat just because you don't like being trampled on, robbed, and abused. So now you're declared a dissident, and the way it went in Nazi Germany is they allowed people to speak on air like I'm doing now. They allowed people to speak freely. It gave the illusion that there was freedom. But slowly behind the scenes, what was happening was the German population was being brainwashed into accepting a new leader with a new dictate, which basically took away the rights of the people to speak out. And at the last moment, when Hitler was ready to make his move, he shut down all the free-speaking independent news outlets. And immediately when a totalitarian regime takes over a government or a people, they kill off the intellectuals, the artists, the poets, the authors. Why? Because these are your thinkers. These are the ones that can speak coherently and possibly organize the people, provide leadership against the prevailing tyrannical authorities. Feel free to call in on this topic. The number is 414-935-2951. I'm Michael Wordsworth, and you're listening to Breaking Down the News, a news program, talk show provided by riverwestradio.com, located here in River West. Now to continue on with the American Thinkers article, we're going to continue with this article that I was reading previously. One small problem. The council, in effect, ignores the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, a law that bars the military from exercising domestic police powers. Let me just break this down for you real quick. Posse Comitatus, basically at the end of Rome, when Caesar was running things, there was this river called the Rubicon, and Caesar was off in Europe conducting his campaigns, and Rome and the Senate always greatly feared. On the one hand, their armies provided them imperial expansion and a lot of revenue. On the other hand, the generals and senators and people back home knew that if any one tyrant were to obtain access to the military as a whole, he could walk into the city and basically take over the nation state. This is very uncomforting, and so the Romans had in place very early on what is basically represented now in our Posse Comitatus Act, a law that bars the military from exercising domestic police powers. In other words, you cannot have men in military uniform conducting local and state police surveillance and or detainment. Meanwhile, on Friday afternoon, March 16th, with little fanfare, Obama issued another executive order, the National Defense Resources Preparedness Act. In this one, he granted himself absolute power over all American resources during times of peace and national emergency, including food, water, livestock, plants, energy, health resources, transportation, and construction material, all without the consent of Congress and the American people. Although this represented an amendment to an existing order, the new phrase, under both emergency and non-emergency conditions, fueled speculation that the new order could allow peacetime martial law. Remember, I was saying that the executive branches traditionally had limited power during peacetime. But since the War Powers Act of 1972, we've had some changes. I mean, remember, Obama went into Libya, which was a situation promoted by NATO. And when Congress asked, hey, can you get approval for this military offensive, which was at the time a no boots on the ground, was just going to be an airstrike thing. But it was basically a war fought by proxy. And the senator asked President Obama, who gave you authority to launch this attack? And the secretary spokesman for President Obama replied, well, NATO did. So we're saying we have a president that doesn't require Congress's approval. Look, I didn't like Bush either. I mean, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, and I'm not here to pick on any one, but all of them, because each side has its faults and weaknesses and shortcomings that they can't seem to see from inside themselves. So here's an outside perspective. Obama was not the answer to Bush, and Bush was not the answer to Obama. Remember, though, at least George Bush went to Congress to obtain permission to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and this was not the case. Well, anyhow, it looks like we haven't had any callers. The number was 414-935-2951. I'm Michael Wordsworth. This is Breaking Down the News. We will be back Wednesday at 3 o'clock. And thank you for participating in today's show. It was quite an episode. Take care.